Hello students in Music 100. This is the preparatory lecture for our class dealing with music from the Middle Ages. Before getting into the content of that particular time though, I want you to take a look at these framing questions. These are questions that I hope will help to help gather the detail that we will be exploring in each one of these eras. It's a way of organizing a lot of the material and being able to see the bigger picture and reflecting upon it. So do feel free to come back and look at these questions sometime. I also will post them in Moodle, but ones that I will be using throughout the course. But today, to take a look at music from the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages being defined, as Wright mentioned, as the time between the fall of Rome and the rebirth of humanism in the 15th century. At least the 15th century in music. Wright does note that in other arts, the Renaissance usually is dated a century earlier. But for musicians, the music of the Middle Ages is defined as approximately 476 to approximately 1450. Well, it was at the end of the Middle Ages when the court challenged the dominance of the church. It's important to remember that this was a time when all fields of knowledge, as well as the teaching of learned skills, that is the teaching of reading and writing, was maintained almost solely by the church. And by the church, I mean the Roman Catholic Church. For hundreds of years, the church was the source of intellectual and artistic life. It cultivated music as it did art, architecture, and poetry. One could see it on the landscape either through rural monasteries or urban cathedrals in the 12th century, such as the Cathedral of Notre Dame on your right. The Pope was considered God's temporal authority on earth, and there is still, of course, a Pope today. Here is the current Pope, Francis I. The Middle Ages was also a time of major developments in the history of distributing music. And the reason why I mention this is because Wright does talk about the development of notation. And I want to digress for a second to put the importance of notation into an even larger picture so we can see how the distribution of music and the way it was distributed had significance throughout the history of music. So as Wright notes, it was around the 10th century that notation began to develop. As we'll see in the class in the Renaissance, music printing was first developed in the 16th century, leading to greater distribution. It wasn't until the end of the 19th century when Thomas Edison and a German by the name of Berliner developed the ability to record music. A huge change in the history of music, in that it meant that one's activity in music could be passive as well as active. That is, the way you would learn music is that you would study it. Well, now you can learn music by just listening to it, and listening to it outside of a concert hall. It was then in the development of mass media in the 1920s, particularly through network radio, that music took another major direction in its distribution. And then, of course, during our time, the development of online music, which started in the 1990s, although it really didn't start to take off until about a decade later. But it was in the 1990s that online music started to take hold. And, of course, that's the decade of Napster as well. Because Wright mentions the development of notation, I thought you might be interested in seeing this slide, which gives an overview of how notation in the broadest sense developed. Now, of course, this was not just a linear development. I mean, there were many digressions and the like, but generally speaking, this slide gives you a sense of how that notation developed. Another thing that Wright talks about is how is sort of the role that music began to play in society. Music within the Middle Ages was really not a profession per se, but it was more a skill. It was something that was part of the quadrivium, that is the upper division of the 7 liberal arts in medieval universities. The other subjects in the quadrivium being arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. And then the trivium, which had grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Now, it's important to remember that what Wright is talking about in the study of music, and what I'm referring to in the study of music, is that we're not talking about so much the development of performance of music, but more of the study of music as a science, as it were. That is, in the theoretical principles of music. This is a painting by Botticelli, which gives a nice representation of a young man being introduced to the 7 liberal arts, one of them being music. For class, I'd like you to keep the following questions in mind. These are ones I'm going to be exploring during our class hour. I'm interested in your being able to tell me who practiced the skill of music based on what you read and write. I'm also interested in the types of compositions they were writing and anything unique about those compositions. This would be both sacred and secular music. And who were some of the important composers? That is, based on your reading. Who appears to be some important people to remember from the Middle Ages, the history of music in the Middle Ages. You may also want to keep this list of vocabulary in mind. These are some of the more important terms from this chapter. I'll be adding a few in class, but from your reading, these are ones that I would pay most attention to and you can expect me to ask about in class. So I will see you then.